begins not with a battlefield, but with a silence so heavy it feels intentional, as if an empire itself is holding its breath before speaking. Between 911 and 609 BCE, in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Neo-Assyrian Empire rose to power by mastering something far more durable than weapons: fear. This was not an age of random cruelty or uncontrolled violence. It was an age where terror was refined, organized, and deployed with purpose. The Assyrians understood that conquest did not end when walls fell, because walls could be rebuilt, but minds, once broken, often could not. So they built an empire that ruled as much through anticipation as through force. In this world, women of political importance became the most dangerous figures alive, not because they wielded armies, but because they carried bloodlines. Queens, princesses, daughters of rival kings were living proofs that legitimacy could exist outside Assyrian control, and that idea alone was intolerable. Killing them would have been easy, but death creates martyrs, and martyrs inspire resistance. The Assyrian solution was colder and far more enduring. Keep them alive, change them, and let their altered existence speak on behalf of the empire. Palace inscriptions and reliefs show kings boasting not only of victories, but of procedures, punishments, and rituals carried out behind sealed doors. In chambers where priests stood beside officials, and suffering followed rules written long before the victim ever arrived. These were not acts of rage. They were rehearsed ceremonies meant to erase identity while preserving breath. Archaeologists would later uncover clay tablets cataloging these practices with unsettling precision, describing the removal of status markers, the alteration of bodies, and the transformation of noble women into warnings that could be displayed, whispered about, and remembered. To the Assyrians, a woman of royal blood was not merely a captive. She was a text to be rewritten, a message to be sent back across borders without ink or parchment. Every step of her degradation was meant to be understood by those who shared her lineage, her language, her former power. This is why the empire invested so much care in how terror looked, sounded, and endured. Fear, when engineered correctly, could govern cities the army never had to revisit. As torches flickered against stone walls, and prayers were recited to gods of love and war alike, the empire tested a philosophy that would haunt history long after its palaces turned to dust: that the human body, especially the body of a woman made symbolic by politics, could be shaped into a tool of rule. And this was only the beginning, because once terror proves effective, it is never used just once. Moves deeper into the lives of the women the Assyrian kings feared most, because these women represented power without holding a sword. In the Assyrian worldview, not all captives were equal. Ordinary women could be enslaved, relocated, or absorbed into the empire's vast labor system, but royal women were something else entirely. A queen or princess was not just a person. She was a living contract, a walking reminder that another dynasty still existed. Her very name could inspire rebellion. Her children could one day reclaim a throne. For the Assyrians, this made her existence intolerable, yet killing her outright was considered a strategic failure. Death erased a threat, but it also erased the lesson. The empire wanted obedience to feel inevitable, not enforced. So these women were taken alive and moved through a hidden world beneath the palaces, a world rarely shown in reliefs or inscriptions meant for public view. Here, priests, scribes, and officials worked together, transforming political enemies into instruments of warning. The first stage was always separation. These women were cut off from servants, family, and even language, surrounded instead by ritual silence and controlled speech. Names were rarely spoken, because in Mesopotamian belief, a name carried power. To strip a woman of her name was to begin erasing her place in history. Clothing followed next. Royal garments, jewelry, and hairstyles were not fashion. They were symbols of authority recognized across the ancient world. Removing them was a calculated act, performed slowly, often accompanied by prayers to Ishtar, the goddess who embodied both love and war, creation and destruction. This duality mattered deeply to Assyrians. What they were doing was framed not as cruelty, but as divine correction. The women were told, through ritual language, that their suffering was necessary to restore cosmic balance, that their bloodlines had offended the gods. Over time, fear replaced resistance, because resistance required hope, and hope was carefully starved. These women were kept alive long enough to be seen, spoken of, and remembered. Some were paraded through conquered cities. Others were returned to their homelands in altered forms, their presence enough to silence councils and end rebellions before they began. The Assyrians understood something profoundly unsettling. People obey more readily when they believe defiance leads not to death, but to a fate worse than death. Every controlled breath of these women reinforced that belief. Their suffering was never random. It followed rules, seasons, and political needs. When one kingdom grew restless, a ritual intensified elsewhere. When another considered revolt, a living warning appeared at its gates. By the time word spread, the damage was already done, because fear travels faster than armies. And as these women disappeared into legend and whisper, the empire learned that terror, when bound to symbolism and patience, could rule longer than any king ever would. Reveals that what the Assyrians practiced was not chaos disguised as cruelty, but ritual carefully disguised as order. Behind the palace walls, far from the reliefs carved for public admiration, existed chambers that served no military purpose and housed no treasure. These rooms were places of preparation, where suffering was staged with the same discipline used to train soldiers. The Assyrians believed that power had to be seen, but fear had to be felt, and to be felt deeply, it needed structure. Every action taken against politically important women followed ceremonial logic rooted in religion, astrology, and tradition. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was improvised. The body of a royal woman was treated not as flesh alone, but as a symbolic landscape upon which the empire could carve meaning. Priests determined the timing of rituals based on omens and stars. Scribes recorded outcomes with disturbing neutrality. Officials observed, ensuring that the procedures matched precedent. This was not punishment carried out in anger. It was punishment executed with patience. The women themselves were rarely told what would happen next. Uncertainty was part of the design. Fear grows strongest when the mind is forced to imagine what the body has not yet endured. Ritual silence was enforced for days or even weeks, broken only by chance, meant to remind the victim that her fate was already written. The Assyrians believed that suffering gained power when it was witnessed by the gods, so prayers accompanied acts that modern minds struggle to comprehend. These prayers did not ask for mercy. They asked for effectiveness. The goal was transformation, not death. Pain was meant to linger, to reshape posture, voice, expression, and presence. A woman who entered these chambers as a symbol of royal pride was meant to leave as a symbol of imperial dominance. Even her movements were controlled afterward, because the empire understood that memory lives in the body. How someone walks, how they speak, how they avoid eye contact, all communicate what words cannot. When these women were later seen by others, their altered behavior completed the ritual. No explanation was necessary. Fear explained itself. This system also protected the empire from internal dissent. By framing cruelty as sacred duty rather than personal desire, responsibility dissolved into tradition. No single hand committed the act. The system did. This made the violence easier to repeat and harder to question. Over time, these rituals became self-sustaining, passed from one reign to the next, refined rather than reconsidered. The chambers remained even as kings changed. New rulers inherited not only territory, but methods. And with each repetition, the empire moved further from simple conquest and deeper into something more unsettling: governance through engineered trauma. What makes this chapter of history especially haunting is not only what was done, but how calmly it was justified. The Assyrians did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as caretakers of order in a dangerous world. And in their logic, the suffering of a few preserved the obedience of many. But as the rituals continued and whispers spread across borders, the empire may not have realized that fear, once perfected, never truly belongs to its creator. It escapes, it mutates, and it waits, quietly shaping the future in ways no king can fully control. Exposes the most disturbing truth of all. Suffering in the Assyrian world was not only ritualized, it was administered. What happened to politically significant women did not rely on the temperament of a king or the cruelty of a single priest. It relied on records. Deep within palace complexes, alongside inventories of grain, troop movements, and tribute, scribes etched pain into clay. These tablets did not read like confessions or boasts. They read like procedures, step by step, condition by condition, outcome by outcome. The same hands that documented harvest yields also documented how long a body could endure before breaking, how silence changed behavior, how repeated fear altered loyalty without spilling blood. This was the true innovation of Assyrian terror. It could be replicated. Any governor, any regional authority could follow the same instructions and produce the same result. Fear became portable. A royal woman taken from her homeland entered a system that already knew what it intended to make of her. Her suffering did not depend on who she was, but on what she represented. Bureaucracy removed emotion from cruelty, and that made it efficient. Orders traveled through chains of command, stripped of detail, leaving only purpose. Preserve life, erase status, ensure visibility. These were not moral judgments. They were administrative goals. Even mercy was calculated. A woman might be spared further ritual, not because compassion emerged, but because the political objective had been achieved. Once fear spread far enough, additional suffering became unnecessary. The empire understood that terror loses power if overused. Precision mattered. Timing mattered. Documentation ensured consistency. And because everything was recorded, nothing was accidental. If a ritual failed to produce obedience, it was adjusted. If resistance continued, the method intensified elsewhere. This feedback loop turned cruelty into policy improvement. What makes this system especially chilling is that it allowed individuals to feel blameless. A priest could say he followed divine instruction. A scribe could say he only recorded events. An official could say he enforced the king's will. Responsibility dissolved into layers, making the system nearly impossible to confront from within. For the women trapped inside it, there was no appeal, no moment where pleading reached a human ear. They were no longer seen as people, but as variables in a formula designed to control entire populations. Over time, the empire's reputation grew so dark that resistance often collapsed before armies arrived. Councils remembered what had happened to daughters and queens. Kings reconsidered rebellion, not because they feared death, but because they feared survival under Assyrian rule. This was the ultimate success of the system. Violence no longer needed to be constantly performed. Its memory did the work, but buried beneath this efficiency was a quiet instability. An empire that governs through terror must continuously prove its willingness to use it. The records grew thicker, the procedures more refined, and with every tablet pressed into clay, the Assyrians bound themselves tighter to a philosophy they could never safely abandon. Because the moment fear stops being absolute, it turns inward, asking questions power was never meant to answer. Confronts the silence that followed, the long centuries during which these stories remained buried, not only under sand and stone, but under human reluctance. When the ruins of Assyrian cities were first excavated in the 19th century, scholars celebrated the discovery of palaces, libraries, and epic inscriptions. The empire was framed as brutal but brilliant, violent yet advanced. But among the thousands of tablets lay texts that did not fit comfortably into heroic narratives of kings and conquest. These records described procedures without drama, suffering without poetry, and control without apology. Many early translators hesitated. Some delayed publication. Others summarized vaguely, choosing softer language that stripped the texts of their true weight. It was not the difficulty of the Akkadian language that slowed progress. It was the moral difficulty of what the language revealed. To translate these tablets honestly meant admitting that one of the world's earliest civilizations had perfected cruelty as governance. It meant acknowledging that this was not an aberration, not a moment of madness, but a sustained policy supported by religion, law, and administration. For decades, these documents were discussed in academic margins, footnotes, and private correspondence rather than public lectures. The focus remained on architecture, military innovation, and literature, while the experiences of women were reduced to passing references. This silence shaped how history was taught and remembered. The Assyrians became symbols of ancient violence, but not of ancient intention. Only later, as Assyriology matured and scholars grew more willing to confront uncomfortable truths, did a clearer picture emerge. Patterns began to appear across tablets from different reigns and regions. The same language, the same methods, the same objectives. What once seemed isolated now looked systematic. And at the center of this system were women whose names appeared briefly, then vanished, leaving only descriptions of what was done to them. Modern historians began to realize that these women were never meant to be remembered as individuals. Their purpose was to be remembered as warnings. This realization forced a reevaluation of Assyrian power. Fear was not a byproduct of empire. It was its foundation. The cruelty inflicted on royal women was not excess. It was demonstration. Understanding this reshaped how scholars interpreted reliefs, inscriptions, and even myths. Scenes once viewed as symbolic now carried heavier implications. What had been dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda aligned too closely with administrative records to ignore. The discomfort did not end with interpretation. It extended to a broader question. How many other histories were softened because telling the truth felt unbearable? The Assyrian case exposed a larger pattern in how humanity remembers itself. Violence against women, especially when tied to politics and power, is often minimized, rationalized, or reframed as necessary. The tablets resisted that reframing. Their tone was too calm, too precise. They offered no excuse, only method. And in that method lay the most unsettling lesson of all, that civilization and cruelty are not opposites, and that the impulse to look away is itself part of how such systems survive. By finally reading these texts as they were written, not as history wished them to be, scholars reopened a chapter that demanded to be faced, not for shock, but for understanding. Closes not with conquest or collapse, but with a reckoning that stretches far beyond the fall of the Assyrian kings. The Neo-Assyrian Empire eventually crumbled, its cities burned, its palaces buried, its power broken by the very forces it once terrorized. Yet the philosophy it perfected did not vanish with its walls. What the Assyrians proved, with chilling clarity, was that fear could be engineered, standardized, and passed down like any other tool of rule. By turning living women into symbols of submission, the empire discovered a form of control that did not require constant violence, only the memory of it. This was their darkest legacy. Long after the rituals ended, the silence they created continued to govern behavior. Kingdoms remembered. Families remembered. Even when names were lost, the lesson remained intact. Do not resist. Survival can be worse than death. The Assyrians believed they were preserving order in a chaotic world, but in doing so, they revealed something deeply unsettling about human systems of power. When cruelty becomes normalized, it no longer needs justification. It becomes tradition. It becomes law. It becomes invisible to those who benefit from it. The women who suffered were never meant to be mourned individually. Their pain was designed to dissolve into collective fear, to be absorbed into rumor, legend, and warning. That is why history tried to forget them. Remembering them meant questioning not only one empire, but the idea that progress naturally softens power. The ruins of Nineveh and Kalhu stand today as reminders of collapse, but they also stand as reminders of success, because for centuries, the Assyrian strategy worked. Rebellions ended before they began. Orders held. Authority felt inevitable. This forces a difficult reflection. Effectiveness and morality are not the same thing. An empire can function flawlessly while committing unforgivable acts. The danger lies in mistaking endurance for righteousness. The Assyrians did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as architects of stability, and that belief allowed them to cross boundaries that once crossed could not easily be uncrossed. What makes this story enduring is not only what happened, but how familiar its logic remains. Throughout history, bodies have been used as messages. Pain has been justified as deterrence. Silence has been mistaken for peace. The Assyrian kings were not anomalies. They were early adopters of a truth humanity repeatedly rediscovers, that fear is efficient but corrosive. It erodes empathy, distorts memory, and eventually turns inward. Empires built on terror must constantly feed it until it consumes them as well. By remembering these women not as symbols, but as human beings caught in a system designed to erase them, we resist the final victory of that system. Their suffering was meant to warn the future into obedience. Instead, it stands as a warning of a different kind, about how easily power can convince itself that cruelty is order, and how vital it is, even centuries later, to refuse that lie.